This is a presentation on learning styles for INTC 5110. I gave you some links, so you should have these already in the Module 2 folder for you to take learning styles inventories. So if you haven't done that already, you should probably go do that before you continue with this presentation, and then come back to this next slide. So there are different theories of learning styles, obviously. There's many different ones. Usually most of them try to break it down into things like visual. Are you a visual learner or a kinesthetic learner? Things like that. And this is in a long line of these kinds of surveys and constructs. So I'll start talking about a few here. One is Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs is not really a learning styles inventory, but it's a personality test. But it's been used heavily both in business and in education as a way to try to measure people and their style of working with others. So you would see that you were a certain kind of type, say an IFNJ, so that means you're intuitive and you're feeling and you're judging, and those things all sort of work together. And the idea is that certain types don't work well with other types and work well with certain other types. And the idea would be that if you wanted to put together a really good team of people, you would try to balance out these different personality types. However, there are no corroborated studies or corroborating studies that measure achievement based on this. So in other words, there's no evidence that putting teams together due to a Myers-Briggs scores would actually result in them doing better in terms of a job or a project. So there's this idea that learning styles exist or personality types exist, but actually seeing the benefit of using that information is a little harder to come by. And we can talk about some reasons why a little bit later. Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence theory is probably one of the more famous ones in education as far as learning styles go. And Gardner basically was trying to suggest that there are, in fact, 7 different kinds of intelligence, not just the 2 that we tend to measure. For Gardner, that would be verbal, linguistic, and logical, mathematical are the ones that we generally have tested in the past. The most IQ tests are trying to get at that. But Gardner's suggesting that there's other things that are just as valid, like such as musical intelligences, visual, spatial intelligence, bodily kinesthetic intelligence, the ability to think about yourself, the ability to relate to others. So these are the kinds of things that Gardner was trying to get at. So he tries to redefine intelligence not as it's generally thought of, which is the scores you get on certain IQ tests, like the Stanford IQ test, but rather as a potential to process information in certain settings to solve problems or create products. So Gardner himself has actually never held that this is a theory about intelligence. He's always said this is basically an idea. That it is a theory about intelligence, but it's not a prescriptive theory. In other words, it shouldn't be taken and used to develop curriculum. However, schools have done just that. There are actually schools that have revised their entire curriculum to try to hit Gardner's multiple intelligences. And he has always stated that this is not what he was trying to get at. What he's really trying to do is just tweak the intelligence community. He was trying to get them to try to consider other things because intelligence was used in such a terrible way. It was used to create different classes of kids. It was used to give the message to certain kids that didn't do well on these IQ tests were somehow flawed or stupid, essentially. And so the idea was that he wanted to get away from that, and he wanted to try to get the intelligence testing community to think in different ways. And so I gave you a link as well to this article about reframing the mind, which essentially is a critique of the Gardner multiple intelligence theory. And that again suggests, just like with Myers-Briggs, there's no research that supports these claims that multiple intelligence will in fact increase student achievement. So students won't do any better just because you figure out that they're a visual or a kinesthetic learner and you start providing them with all kinds of information, materials, assignments that try to take advantage of those things. So in other words, if you teach them a certain way, if you teach them well, they're going to do just as well whether you taught them to their intelligence or what you think is their intelligence or you did not. Brain-based learning is another learning style-based theory. Kane and Kane brought this up and suggested that the structure of the brain is predictive of how people will learn. In other words, if you have a certain well-developed part of your brain, then you would be able to learn certain things better than other things, and that's that whole left brain, right brain thing, which again is only loosely based on neuroscience. So in other words, even the neuroscience community itself doesn't support the use of this of its research this way. So they say, no, we're not saying that someone is left brain and therefore you should teach them a certain way. What they're saying is, we just found this kind of interesting thing about the brain and we don't know what it means. Or in fact, in a lot of the evidence does support it, that there is no left brain, right brain. That people that have impairments or lose certain parts of function in their brain will adapt and then still do those same kinds of things, but just with a different part of their brain. So there's not as much of a direct correlation as some people have been led to believe. However, again, I've seen entire programs and curriculum based on brain-based research, and again, this is a little bit of a problem in my mind for schools. There is one particular learning style related theory though that has held up, and that's called locus control. Locus control is the idea of where you like the control of your learning to be. Do you prefer it to be external to you and reside with the teacher, so that, in other words, you're the one that asks, will this be on a test, or what do you expect of me? So you're always looking to the teacher to provide that framework. Or your internal locus control, which means that you are the one that wants to decide how you go about things and what you learn and how you learn it. And so this is the only thing that has actually sort of held up over time. So it's a construct that seems to actually work, unlike the learning styles. But all these learning style related theories all run into the same problems, which is, how are they measured? Most of the time we don't measure these things very empirically. What we do instead is we do some kind of survey or questionnaire, and you self-report your answers, and then we take those things and we try to say, okay, well, if you answer certain questions certain ways, that makes you more of this kind of learner, or that you have this kind of locus of control, or this personality. And that's usually not a very solid measure. Self-report surveys are not the best way to get data. If you can get it another way, or at the very least, you should be able to corroborate it with a different test, and that's never really happened with these things. It also tends not to be stable. In other words, you tend to change over time. So the Myers-Briggs I took when I was 20 is very different than the Myers-Briggs I take at 40. Why would that be? If you had a consistent learning style, wouldn't it stay the same? And so the idea becomes, well, when do you know that you changed? And so if somebody was to say, well, I'm going to teach you in a visual way because you're a visual learner, and you take the test, say 2 years later or 3 years later, and you find out that, no, in fact, I'm a kinesthetic learner now. How does that, did you just miss the whole chance to teach them the right way? Does it predict anything? In other words, can I predict that you'll do well in a certain area or a certain way or a certain job, let's say, because of the learning style that you have? No, nobody's ever been able to show that. And the last one would be, if we change instruction to accommodate learning styles or personality styles or whatever, does it actually help? The only thing, again, that's ever been shown to do this is locus of control. So in conclusion, you might say, well, am I totally down on learning styles? I'm not entirely down on the concept, because obviously there's a lot of practical reasons to sort of see this as a valuable thing. In other words, if I can teach students a lot of different ways, then I'm more likely to get the idea across. However, to go whole hog and make big changes in instruction based on this, I think is wrong. So my suggestion would be that what we do with this is that we simply hold it in the back of our minds and try to vary the way that we teach things. Try to make sense and practical decisions on how we present certain information in such a way that maybe we are helping the student to see it in different ways, and maybe one of those ways will be the way that clicks for that particular student. But I don't think we can be very predictive with learning styles. So, and that's probably kind of a downer for many of you, but based on the research, it's very hard to see learning styles as particularly valuable as a way to design curriculum, but it may be a practical way to sort of help you measure or at least be reflective of your own practices. So I hope this helps, and hopes this helps. It probably doesn't help, but it probably confuses things, but it gives you something to talk about. So I hope that in a forum, in the discussion forum, that you'll be able to talk about this more. Thank you very much.